Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to tell you about this sword right here. It is a 51 CRV4 Katana from Cloudhammer Steelworks. And before I get into the review, as is tradition, a couple disclaimers. One, this is a review sample. It was sent to me for free from Cloudhammer Steelworks. I didn't have to pay any money, and if you think that makes me biased, you know at the start. Now, I have pushed this to failure. Originally, it was sent to me under the assumption I would send it back in reasonably good shape, but I later got permission to break it and push it all the way to failure, which I have done and will elaborate on in this video. Also, note that I am a Japanese swordsmanship practitioner. I've been at it for a number of years. I've been reviewing for a number of years, but I don't consider myself an authority figure on the subject, so keep all that context in mind as you hear my babbles. All right, sword friends, I need to edit in one additional disclaimer here, and that is that I do not have video footage of the original sword as it came to me from Cloudhammer Steelworks. And apologies to Cloudhammer Steelworks, RVA Katana, and to you for that being the case. I don't know if I didn't record it or if I lost it, but in either case, I don't have it. And rather than bluff my way through some magic of editing, I'm just going to share with you the bits and bobs and features of the sword after it's been damaged. And obviously, that's not fair to Cloudhammer Steelworks. It's going to look a little worse for wear because it's been through hell. But hopefully that context up front makes sense. If you're wondering why it doesn't look particularly great, that's because I've pushed it to failure. But all my memories and my notes are still good. I can still do the review. I can still tell you about the sword while it was in original condition. I was also sent a non-bohi version of the sword. So if you see two handles or two things on the screen, it's because I was sent a non-bohi version. And basically, it has the same fuchikasha, it has the same handle, it has many of the same characteristics. So I can share some of that because it wasn't put through as much rigor as the bohi version of the sword, which you're going to see. Anyway, again, sincerest apologies for my kerfuffle here. Hopefully the review is still interesting. Hopefully that context makes sense. This sword, in particular, is about a $300 sword, supposedly made of 51 CRV4. I say that not because I doubt it, but because I have no way of really validating. It's supposed to be a nice steel and treated well and durable and all that kind of stuff, which is kind of the claim to fame or some of the unique stuff that Cloudhammer Steelworks is putting out. They make some exotic steels, or at least steels that you don't see commonly mentioned on the market. This one was also sent to me with a companion Iaito, and I thought that was really, really cool. I have reviewed the Iaito already. I'll link that in the description down below. But just to call out one awesome experience that I thought was really cool and that I haven't had despite my years of collecting and playing with and reviewing, was that I got this Musashi sharp sword and a companion Iaito piece, which was very, very similar. The lengths of the grips were similar. The material was similar. They felt like basically the same sword. In the nuances and details, there were some differences in weight and stuff, but basically they felt the same. So when I was practicing with the Iaito, building up speed and confidence and training and kind of warming up a little bit, I could then take the sharp sword out and more or less have some degree of familiarity or muscle memory or something like that without the jarring experience of shifting to a heavier or lighter sword. And typically when I break out a cutting sword over an Iaito, it's usually a heavier sword, and I kind of have to adjust to that heavier weapon. That wasn't the case here. I thought that was really fun. I'll talk about that a little bit at the end, but suffice to say I thought that was very cool, and that was maybe the punchline of my Iaito review. Anyway, on with the review of this one. It is a $300 sword, and that's the context I'm going to be keeping in mind as I talk about it. All right, I'm going to start with the kasha, the end bit right here, and more or less this is in like a basket weave type of theme, and I can make out the details on it, but not enough. This is a kind of a muddy looking texture quality in that it could be more detailed. At the same time, it doesn't have to be, and I like that it's simple enough. I would say it gets a pass in terms of details. It's detailed enough. It doesn't look like the molds are super worn or bad. At the same time, I recognize I've seen very, very elaborate kind of matte or straw weave types of formats, and it could be a lot crisper. The fitting as well, I would say, is durable. Later in the review, you'll see that I threw this sword at a tree. It hit on the kasha first, and it dented in. And it took the weight of the sword from a guy like me throwing it at a tree and stayed in one piece. It didn't fracture, it didn't break, but it did bend, and that suggests to me that it could give somebody a pretty good thump. So it's a reasonably well-made piece as well. Transitions, when the blade was in good shape, it unfortunately is not now, did have some ledges, and I think it's an opportunity for improvement here. If there were a better transition, I think that would be appreciated, though it is worth noting that none of the fittings bit into me. It wasn't uncomfortable while I was using it, and for the purposes of EI or just generally training, I thought it was overall a pretty comfortable experience, but those transitions could be a little cleaner. Moving up to the Iaito. The Iaito is in this kind of leather wrap that Cloudhammer Steelworks is becoming a little bit famous for, or at least is somewhat unique to them. And it feels to me like a lazy boy. It feels like jacket leather. It's supple, it's comfortable on my hands. At the same time, it's wrapped tight enough where it doesn't give me this kind of jarring sense of looseness or make me feel disconnected from the weapon. I do really like the material. Now, in this particular case, I think it could be tied tighter. I had the Iaito, I had a few other examples from Cloudhammer Steelworks, and the tightness does vary slightly. Generally speaking, though, I would say it is in the realm of passing good even. I can push on it, I can displace it slightly, but not so much that it caused me any concern that it's going to come unraveled. And in fairness, every Cloudhammer Steelworks sword that I've tested to failure or played with for any length of time has stayed pretty consistent. The diamonds don't move around, the handles haven't come undone or unraveled, the kashras haven't come off, and that is a testament to quality. Very often, as I've tested a few different swords from other manufacturers, inevitably at some point I get a looser one, the kashra comes off, things start coming unraveled. And that hasn't really happened here on any of the examples from Cloudhammer Steelworks that I've tested. And having now pushed a couple of them to failure, I would say that it gives me some assurance in the tightness of the Iaito and the material that they're using. The diamonds do wander a little bit. The Samigawa skin does not have any particularly large nodules or something like that. But again, this is a very budget-conscious sword, so I'm not expecting a whole lot here. The fact that I don't make out giant panel gaps or lines or something like that is overall, I think, exceeding the expectations or above average, in fairness. It's nice to have a nice-looking handle. It's nice when there are not panel lines or you can't kind of see how the sausage is made and make out the core wood underneath the Iaito, and that's the kind of quality I guess I'm seeing here. Overall, I think the Iaito wrap is sufficient, nice even, and it's very comfortable for use. The Minuki are also gold, not particularly elaborate in terms of the detail oriented here, and really my eye is drawn to these, the Fuchi Kashra and Minuki. They do stand out as very bold. That's an aesthetic choice. I don't particularly like it. I'd like them to be a little bit more subtle. I have seen examples, though, of other Cloudhammer Steelworks blades that are a little bit more subtle or tie or don't make my eye fixate so much on the furniture. Moving up to the Fuchi, the transition here is a little nicer, a little more even, but overall still has some minor ledge to it, although very minor, more of a real nitpick here and perfectly acceptable for the price point of the sword. Now, one other thing I'd like to draw your attention to is the peg that's used. Now, this does appear to be a bamboo peg in contrast to some of the other swords that I've seen that use like a Delrin or some other kind of resin type of peg. This is a bamboo peg, but the edges are still chamfered on it, and they're putting attention to detail in the materials that are used. I appreciate it. Very often it seems like a chopstick is stuffed in and then broken off or maybe sanded down, and that's what you get in the $300 price point. But here, chamfered edges, it might be fire-hardened bamboo, I'm not entirely sure, but the handles have held together, and these little nuances, these little details that they're attending to, give me some confidence that they're attending to other details that I can't see or can't measure in the process of sword making. So those little chamfered edges, I notice them and I like them. It's also worth noting that there's only one Makugi peg, and that one Makugi peg allows the sword, I think, to tighten up a little bit better. Now, very often on mass production swords, you see two Makugi, and that might give you a backup in case one fails. At the same time, they tend to play off each other and not tighten up as well. And traditionally speaking, you would very often find one Makugi as opposed to two. So I do like that I'm only seeing one here. Moving up to the tsuba. This was a Musashi theme tsuba, and I like it. It had depth and dimension, kind of edges and chamferness. It wasn't basically just a simple Musashi cutout. It had a little bit of zazz to it, and I appreciated it. I like the overall look of the tsuba, and I would also note that it held up well. Again, I threw this at a tree. At one point, it hit the tsuba, and the tsuba bent, and that... You may say, well, I don't want a tsuba that bends, and I would say that is maybe the wrong attitude to have, because being hit by a tree is quite a lot of impact to be taken by a guard, and the important bit is that it bent. It didn't break off, it didn't fracture, it didn't dent in. That gives me the impression that this handle would bend, it would protect my hand, it would serve its purpose rather than break off or shatter, which I wouldn't be surprised if a number of other inexpensive alloy-based tsubas would do. Now, the habaki on the blade is a simple brass habaki. Cloudhammer can do some pretty interesting stuff with habaki, so if you're interested in getting something with a little bit more zazz, the option is available to you. At the same time, this one is a pretty simple one, though this is a pretty simple sword in the kind of general $300 price point. It's more towards the top end of the budget katana, but at the same time, it is a budget piece, and I'm not expecting a whole lot of zazz, at least not any more than I've already seen. If I move on to the saya, tension overall was actually pretty good. It held well in the saya. It wasn't too tight, it wasn't too loose, it didn't have a lot of rattle. It, from a practitioner standpoint, was what I would consider correct or good. It could have glided in a little better. It didn't feel like it was on rails or something like that, which, in fairness, very often Japanese-made Iaito do. However, it still felt decent, and the only complaint that I would have is that the habaki kind of whacked on the edge of the koiguchi, the mouth of the scabbard, and it was something I had to get used to while I was drawing. This is a common thing that I see on Chinese-made Japanese-style swords, if you're using them as a practitioner's tool, that isn't necessarily present on the Iaito of equivalent price made in Japan. But it was still something I could work around. It was still a fine practitioner's tool. I could still get used to it. And overall, for the $300 Chinese-made sharp sword, I would say it was still a very functional and easy tool to use if you're doing Iaito or drawing and sheathing the sword repeatedly into the scabbard. The scabbard was an ishime kind of finish, which means it doesn't show fingerprints. It has kind of a stone-looking splatter pattern on the surface, and I like this. It doesn't show fingerprints really easily, and also if you chip it, you can kind of touch it up with a Sharpie, which doesn't stand out as much in comparison to its gloss counterparts. There appeared to more or less be a wood koiguchi, kojiri, and kurigata. It doesn't look like there are horn pieces incorporated here. There are other swords in the $300 price point that do include some of those things. At the same time, I can't say that I'm particularly bothered by it. The koiguchi and kurigata were sufficient, and I've already noted where it could be improved, but all of them are at least in the right place, and it at least was reasonably quiet and didn't rattle. So the saya is doing all the things that I would suppose it should. The kurigata did have shitodome in it that were not glued in. I've talked about this a number of times on other reviews, but I did get recently an update or a different thought process on shitodome, in the sense that gluing them in means they're in there permanently and hard to take out, and very often the shitodome used are maybe not the color you want, or maybe cheap pieces that can be replaced with something else. And if they're glued in, that doesn't give you the option. But gluing them in is a pretty easy thing to do. A little dab of glue and some time, and you've got shitodome that are glued in if you want them. But if you don't want them in there, then taking them out can damage the kurigata. It can look worse. It can be kind of a pain in the butt. So some people prefer that they are not glued in. I still prefer them to be glued in and would have liked to see them glued in. That's a personal preference. I do appreciate that there's a different perspective out there, though. All right, the blade, the pointy stabby part. There's really not a whole lot to say here about the blade. You can see that it has a decent profile, the one that's probably familiar to you if you're used to seeing my reviews on Japanese-style swords made in China. It has a pretty standard Sori. It has a pretty standard width, and all those dimensions and all that kind of stuff are in the description down below as well. The point is that this is also a through-hardened blade, so it doesn't have a hada. It doesn't have a lot kind of going on in the surface of the steel. It's a very inexpensive and kind of durable focused blade. The bohi had surface ripples in it. The lines on it were reasonably clean, though the polish, not a lot of attention was invested in here. It was shiny, and there was an attempt at a yokote. It was more geometric than polished in, and you can kind of make out the change in direction in the grinding. Overall, though, it's a simple looking blade. It came out of the box relatively sharp enough to do all of the cutting that you're going to see. I didn't have to sharpen or hone it at all, and that's really it. Unfortunately, there's not much else to see. There's no hamon, there's no hada, there's no other character in the blade. The shaping and the grinding on it was sufficient, and that's really the purpose that you're going for here. This is not a blade that has those artistic qualities. If you wanted them, I believe Cloudhammer offers different blades that may have those options available. This one is a little bit more focused on being a through-hardened, durable product than a zazzy, artsy-fartsy, cool zazzification kind of sword. Very technical terms there. So that brings me to the usage side of things. Now, I did talk about the EI perspective, and I reviewed its Iaito counterpart that was sent already, but I do want to point out that it was just a fun tool to use. I would note that a Japanese-made Iaito was a better experience for drawing and sheathing if that's all you're going to do. If the aim is specifically Iaito, then a Japanese-made Iaito I find to be a superior experience. But this is the Shenkin, the sharp version, and those are not as inexpensive or abundantly available in the made-in-Japan variety. So if you're looking for a sharp sword, this was still a fun tool, and I really enjoyed the experience of having an Iaito and a sharp sword to use that were made of the same thing. So if you're going to buy a sword like this and you want to use an Iaito as well, highly recommend that you get the same sword made in a dull version and it lets you train and practice and warm up and rep speed drills and then have a sword of equivalent weight in your hand. I thought that was such a fun and cool experience. I highly recommend it if you have the opportunity. I was glad I got to try something like that, and now I'd be more inclined to buy an Iaito and a Shinken or a sharp sword that were the same sword, but a dull version. I found it to be a very helpful training tool. Suffice to say, though, it was a fine training tool. I practiced with it quite a bit, and while I would still say a Japanese-made Iaito is better for just that specific activity, this sharp sword was no slouch either, and I found it to be a comfortable training companion. In the realm of cutting, well, I did lots of stuff with it. It had a reasonably sharp edge. I cut water bottles. It did that just fine. I cut branches and stuff like that. And it's worth noting that there's a path of escalation here. I'm cutting bottles. I cut a tatami mat. I cut a bunch of other stuff that sword should be able to cut. And basically, I would say the cutting was sufficient. It could have been honed and been even sharper. And if you wanted to do trick cuts with it, the iteration that I had with the bohi was not a bad one. It was comfortable enough to use for hours of training. And I imagine it's quick enough to do some schmancier cuts if you are looking for some speed types of tricky cuts and whatnot. But anyway, a fun and sufficient cutter. I didn't have any problems with it bending or chipping or rolling or taking edge deformation. All in all, it held up really well, even through branches and some of the more aggressive stuff. Now, it's worth noting that I've had this sword for a minute. I did EI with it at my previous home. I've moved. I've had it for like half a year now. And over the course of training, it's held up. It didn't loosen. It didn't do anything bad. And in the change of weather, when I finally got around to doing some destructive testing on it, that's when I started to really push it. So I cut ice blocks with it. I cut the same kind of frozen branches. Now, these branches were felled earlier in the summer, and so they're still wet. They're kind of frozen. I cut these frozen branches with the sword. And again, no bending, no chipping, no rolling. And honestly, the edge actually stayed pretty sharp. And given that this isn't a super hard sword, I was reasonably impressed with the edge retention, though maybe it was cold and it was just a frozen edge, a popsicle or something on it. Later, I took the sword and I stuck it in the ground and I beat it with a club and threw the sword at a tree and did all manner of other things to it. And realistically, it held up really well. I continued to strike the sword and stuff like that. I didn't notice any bending despite my efforts hitting it with a club and throwing it at a tree. Again, the tsuba bent, the kashura bent, but the sword itself didn't bend much at all, other than some tip deformation from hitting the ground and me throwing it basically into the frozen dirt, which is full of rocks and whatnot. There's a gravel area there, and I believe I hit a rock with the tip, and it had some minor issues there. But overall, pretty minor stuff given what was done to it. Then I brought it to the Tree of Woe, as I'm coming to call it. Other swords have broken on this tree. I did some strikes into the tree and then struck the flat on the sword, and relatively quickly the sword broke. Now, it's worth noting that on this particular section of tree, I would say that this, despite how well the sword held up, is a bit of a surprise failure on the sword's part. I would have liked to see it bend, I would have liked to see it twist, or I would have liked to see it take many more strikes into the tree before it deformed, but I don't really expect it to break in half on this part of at least the way I'm doing this here. I found that to be, unexpected, to say the least. So anyway, it broke on the Tree of Woe. I then took the sword and moved on to a different test. Now, because I had this sword, I thought, well, I was hoping to test another sword. John at RVA Katana sent me a T10 sword to test along with it, and unfortunately the sword broke before I could do kind of metal-on-metal interactions. But I took the half sword that I had remaining and brought it out to do some of that stuff. So I struck this T10 sword, and more or less what you can see is that the T10 sword seems to be winning. There's more edge deformation on the 51 CRV4 blade than there is on the T10 blade. And several repeated strikes continue to kind of show the same thing. There's basically more damage happening to the CRV4 blade than the T10 blade. Though the T10 blade that I'm testing that's in my stand is a differentially hardened blade. The edge is likely harder. T10, I believe, has more carbon content than 51 CRV4. The 51 CRV4 blade that I'm testing is also just a softer. So basically, it's doing kind of what you would expect it to do. But after securing the blade, I just kind of wound up and struck the base of it, and you can see that it broke the T10 blade. And it took a lot of damage in doing it. There's a big gouge in the blade, but more or less the sword did basically, it didn't cut through, it cracked the blade, and the other piece flew away, but the T10 blade that I tested did break on the other sword. And the 51 CRV4 blade, well, it took a lot of damage, didn't further break or another section of it didn't break off. Now, I reached out to John at RVA Katana, let him know about where it broke, let him know that I didn't think that was necessarily a great thing. And he opted to send me another 51 CRV4 blade, this time without a bohi, for me to test. So I brought that out to test on the same tree of woe to see if I had a similar experience. And upon testing, it's worth noting that this sword came to me in a slightly damaged condition. It looked like it had been used, and I skipped all the other bits of testing. I didn't cut water bottles. I didn't throw it. I didn't do anything else to the sword. It did look like it had some use on it already, but I jumped right to the tree of woe. And it's also worth noting that the first time the sword broke, it was 20 degrees out. So that's well below freezing. It's pretty chilly outside, but it's also not negative 20, which is often what it gets to this time of year in the spot that I live. The day that I tested the second sword without a bohi was 33 degrees, just above freezing. And it took a lot more to break the sword. I could hit it many, many times on the flat, and it didn't break. It wasn't a gentle slap. I really swung for it, and then upon taking two hands and really winding up and striking it, I was kind of about ready to move on. I didn't think it was going to break. I was able to break it by striking the flat against the side of the tree of woe. And I've come to call it the tree of woe. It's a tree that needs to come down, but it has been the bane of a few different swords now. The point is that it did break by striking the flat on that tree again. And looking at the cross-section of either blade, I would say that the grain structure appears to be a little bit on the coarse side. Now, even though the grain structure was a little bit on the coarse side, I would still say it's worth pointing out the amount of punishment these swords took to bring themselves to the point of breaking. One, I beat with a club, and it was a light, lively sword with a bohi. It's also worth noting it was 20 degrees when it broke, though other swords I've tested at 20 degrees have bent or deformed, and even though cold tends to accelerate the breaking, the metal still bends, typically. So I'd still say breaking is not ideal. And the second one took a lot more strikes against that tree of woe in order to get to basically the same spot. And so I would say it's not ideal that they broke, but I don't want to understate the amount of punishment that at least the first sword took to get to the point of breaking. And if you avoid striking the flat of a sword on a really cold day against a tree, you're probably going to be fine given the amount of other shenanigans I put the sword through. So that brings me to the point, do I personally think it's worth it or not? And for $300, I would still say yes. Well, it's not ideal that it broke in the place that it did, and it is certainly a major deterrent for me. I would still say this is a budget-conscious sword, and other swords tend to be a little bit on the soft side. This one seems to be a little bit maybe on the harder side. It held an edge really well. It seemed to cut really well. It seemed to come with a nice sharp edge out of the box. It seemed to be nice as a training tool as well, and have other features like fittings that held together and would actually protect your hand, and Iaito that was nice to use and comfortable as a training tool. And I, again, really loved the companion of the Iaito and the Shenken, the sharp version, using them and practicing with the dull one, building up some muscle memory, and then breaking out the sharp one to do some test cutting. I thought that was a really awesome experience, and if you're going to get one sword and you're considering getting the Iaito, doing a steel one that matches basically your sharp sword, so that you have a sword that's really, really similar, one that's dull and safer to train with, and one that's sharp when you want to break out and do sharp sword related things. I thought those things were really cool in the fact that they're offered at a budget, and for $600 basically, given that they were both $300, you could have that experience. I think is something I would definitely say is worth it. This sword on its own, though, seemed to hold up pretty well. In comparison to other $300 swords, though, it's worth noting that other $300-ish swords have held up a little bit better, but this one does have a leg up on some. I go back to the Ronin Dojo Pro. It's been a very durable, it's made of 1060, but it was a little bit more durable in terms of steel. It held up a little bit better to some of the aggressive punishment, but the Ska was not necessarily as durable. The Iaito tended to be looser, it was less comfortable. So in terms of training, in terms of doing most basic stuff, I would prefer the Cloudhammer Steelworks to the Dojo Pro. But when I go to the really abusive, really crazy abusive stuff, I think the Dojo Pro in a similar price point is maybe a little bit better. Though it is worth noting that they make the S7 Katana that I tested some time ago, and that one held up better than the Dojo Pro did. So they do make other swords that will hold up even more if that's the aim that you want. Is specifically durability, the S7, and supposedly the S5, though I haven't tested it to failure, is even stronger than S7, or at least more resilient in that way. The S7 sword kind of stands apart as one of the most difficult to break swords, I've gotten a test, and that was a piece from Cloudhammer Steelworks. Anyway, so yes is the short answer for me. Though it is tempered a little bit by breaking the way it did, I would still say it gets a vote of yes for me, given all the other features and given how much it took to break. That's all I've got, though. Hopefully it's been interesting. Hopefully you find it useful. If you have questions or comments, throw them down below. And again, special thanks to RVA Katana and Cloudhammer Steelworks for sending this my way for the purposes of review. Cheers, and thanks for watching.